Chapter 3 of Around the Campfire by Charles Roberts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3 At Camp de Squatook. Part 1. The next morning we got off at a good hour. For the last half-mile of its course we found Beardsley Brook so overgrown with alders that we had to chop and haul our way through it with infinite labor. Here we wasted some time fishing for Sam's pipe, which had fallen overboard among the alders. The pipe was black, with crooked stem, plethoric in build, and so heavy that we all thought it would sink where it fell. As soon as the catastrophe occurred, we halted till the water, here about 2 feet deep, had become clear. Then, peering down among the alder stems, Ranolf spied the pipe on the sandy bottom, looking blurred and distorted through the writhing current. Long we grappled for it, poking at it with pole and paddle. We would cautiously raise it a little way towards the surface, but even as we began to triumph, it would wriggle off again, as if actually alive, and settle languidly back upon the sand. We all knew, without Ranolf's elaborate explanations, that its lifelike movement was due to its being so little heavier than the water it displaced, or to the uneven refraction of the light through the moving fluid, or to some other equally satisfactory and scientific cause. Finally, Sam, getting impatient, plunged an arm and shoulder and grasped the pipe victoriously. He came up empty-handed, and we beheld a huge tadpole, now thoroughly aroused, flaunting off downstream in high dudgeon. Ranolf remarked that the laws of refraction were to him obscure, and we continued our journey. The real pipe we overtook farther downstream, floating along jauntily as a cork. Once out upon the Squatook River our course was rapid, for the current was swift and the channel clear. There were some wild rapids, but we ran them victoriously. By noon we were on the bosom of Big Squatook Lake. By 6 o'clock we had traversed this beautiful and solitary water, and were pitching our tent near the outlet, on a soft brown carpet of pine needles. Here was a circular opening amid the huge trunks. Between the lake and our encampment hung a screen of alder and wild cherry, whence a white beach of pebbles slanted broadly to the waves. While Stranion and Queerman made preparations for supper, the rest of us whipped the ripples of the outlet for trout. The shores of the lake at this spot draw together in 2 grand curves, and at the apex flows out the Squatook River, about waist deep and a stone's throw broad. It murmurs pleasantly on for the first few rods, and then begins to dart and chafe and lift an angry voice. Hither the Indians come to spear whitefish in their season. To assist their spearing, they had the outlet fenced part way across with a double row of stakes. All but the smallest fish were thus compelled to descend through a narrow passage, wherein they were at the mercy of the spearmen. This fence we now found very convenient. Letting the canoe drift against it, we perched on top of the stakes, a couple of feet above water, and cast our flies unimpeded in every direction. The trout were abundant, and took the flies freely. For an hour we had most exciting sport. It was in itself, for all true fishermen, worth the whole journey. The Squatook trout are of a good average size and very game. Of the 20-odd fish we killed that evening, there were 2 that passed the 1½ pound scratch upon our scales, and several that cleared the pound. Deciding to spend some days in this fair spot, we named it Camp de Squatook. Lopping the lower branches of the trees, we made ourselves pegs on which to hang our tins and other utensils, while a dry cedar log, split skillfully by Stranion, furnished us with slabs for a table. Our commissariat was well supplied with campers' necessities and luxuries, but it was upon trout above all that we feasted. Sometimes we boiled them, sometimes we broiled them, more often we fried them in the fragrant yellow cornmeal. The delicate richness of the hot, pink, luscious flakes is only to be realized by those who feast on the spoils of their own rods, with the relish of free air and vigor and outdoor appetites. Campers prate much of early hours and of seeking their blankets with sunset, but we held to no such doctrine. Night in these wilds is rich with a mysterious beauty, an immensity of solitude such as day cannot dream of. Supper over, we stretched ourselves out between tent door and campfire, pillowing our heads on the folded bedding. Across the yellow firelit circle, through the trunks and hanging branches, we watched the still gleaming level of the lake, whence at intervals would ring out startlingly clear the goblin laughter of the loon. We were not so tired as on the previous evening, and it took us longer to settle down into the mood for story-telling. At last Stranion was called upon. He was ready, and speech flowed from him at once, as if his mouth had been uncorked. A Night Encounter. "I'll tell you a tale," said he, "of this very spot, on this very Big Squatook, and of course with me and the panther both in it. Once upon a time, that is to say in the summer of 1886, I fished over these waters with Tom Allison. You remember he was visiting Fredericton nearly all that year. We camped right here 2 days, and then went on to the little lake, or second Squatook, just below. One moonlit night, when the windless little lake before our camp was like a shield of silver, and the woody mountains enclosing us seemed to hold their breath for delight, I was seized with an overwhelming impulse to launch the canoe and pole myself up here to Big Squatook. The distance between the two lakes is about 1.5 miles, with rapid water almost all the way, and Allison, who had been amusing himself laboriously all day, was too much in love with his pipe and blankets by the campfire to think of accompanying me. All my persuasions were wasted upon him, so I went alone. Of course I had an excuse. I wanted to set night lines for the gray trout or togue which haunt the waters of Big Squatook. A favorite feeding ground of theirs is just where the water begins to shoal toward the outlet yonder. Strange as it may seem, the togue are never taken in Second Lake or in any other of the Squatook chain. It was a weird journey upstream, I can tell you. The narrow river, full of rapids, but so free from rocks in this part of its course that its voice seldom rises above a loud purring whisper, was overhung by many ancient trees. Through the spaces between their tops fell the moonlight in sharp white patches. As the long, slow thrusts of my pole forced the canoe stealthily upward against the current, the creeping panorama of the banks seemed full of elvish and noiseless life. White trunks slipped into shadow, and black stumps caught gleams of sudden radiance, till the strangeness of it all began to impress me more than its beauty, and I felt a curious and growing sense of danger. I even cast a longing thought backward toward the campfire's cheer and my lazier comrade, and when at length, slipping out upon the open bosom of the lake, I put aside my pole and grasped my paddle, I drew a breath of distinct relief. It took but a few minutes to place my 3 night lines. This done, I paddled with slow strokes toward that big rock farther out yonder. The broad surface was as unrippled as a mirror, like it is now, save where my paddle and the gliding prow disturbed it. When I floated motionless, and the canoe drifted softly beyond the petty turmoil of my paddle, it seemed as if I were hanging suspended in the center of a blue and starry sphere. The magic of the water so persuaded me that presently I hauled up my canoe on the rock, took off my clothes, and swam far out into the liquid stillness. The water was cold, but of a life-giving freshness, and when I had dressed and resumed my paddle, I felt full of spirit for the wild dash home to camp, through the purring rapids and the spectral woods. Little did I dream just how wild that dash was to be. You know the whitefish barrier where you fellows were fishing this evening? Well, at the time of my visit, the barrier extended only to mid-channel, one half having been carried away, probably by logs, in the spring freshets. For this accident, doubtless very annoying to the Indians, I soon had every reason to be grateful. As I paddled noiselessly into the funnel and began to feel the current gathering speed beneath me, and noted again the confused, mysterious glimmer and gloom of the forest into which I was drifting, I once more felt that unwonted sense of danger stealing over me. With a word of vexation I shook it off, and began to paddle fiercely. At the same instant my eyes, grown keen and alert, detected something strange about the bit of Indian fence which I was presently to pass. It was surely very high and massive in its outer section. I stayed my paddle, yet kept slipping quickly nearer. Then suddenly I arrested my progress with a few mighty backward strokes. Lying crouched flat along the tops of the stakes, its head low down, its eyes fixed upon me, was a huge panther. I was completely at a loss, and for a minute or two remained just where I was, backing water to resist the current, and trying to decide what was best to be done. As long as I kept to the open water, of course, I was quite safe, but I didn't relish the idea of spending the night on the lake. I knew enough of the habits and characteristics of the panther to be aware the brute would keep his eye on me as long as I remained alone. But what I didn't know was how far a panther could jump. Could I safely paddle past that fence by hugging the farther shore? I felt little inclined to test the question practically, so I turned about and paddled out upon the lake. Then I drifted and shouted songs and stirred up the echoes for a good round hour. I hoped, rather faintly, that the panther would follow me up the shore. This, in truth, he may have done, but when I paddled back to the outlet, there he was, awaiting me in exactly the same position as when I first discovered him. By this time I had persuaded myself that there was ample room for me to pass the barrier without coming in range of the animal's spring. I knew that close to the farther shore the water was deep. When I was about 30 yards from the stakes, I put on speed, heading for just about the middle of the opening. My purpose was to let the panther fancy that I was coming within his range, and then to change my course at the last moment so suddenly that he would not have time to alter his plan of attack. It is quite possible that this carefully planned scheme was unnecessary, and that I rated the brute's intelligence and forethought quite too high. But however that may be, I thought it safer not to take any risks with so cunning an adversary. The panther lay in the sharp black shadow, so that it was impossible for me to note his movements accurately. But just as an instinct warned me that he was about to spring, I swerved smartly toward him and hurled the light canoe forward with the mightiest stroke I was capable of. The maneuver was well executed, for just before I came fairly opposite the grim figure on the stake tops, the panther sprang. Instinctively I threw myself forward, level with the crossbars, and in the same breath there came a snarl and a splash close beside me. The brute had miscalculated my speed and got himself a ducking. I chuckled a little as I straightened up, but the sigh of relief which I drew at the same time was profound in its sincerity. I had lamentably underestimated the reach of the panther's spring. He had alighted close to the water's edge, just where I imagined the canoe would be out of reach. I looked around again. He was climbing alertly out of the hated bath. Giving himself one mighty shake, he started after me down along the bank, uttering a series of harsh and piercing screams. With a sweep of the paddle I darted across current and placed almost the full breadth of the river between my enemy and myself. I have paddled many a canoe race, but never one that my heart was so set upon winning as this strange one in which I now found myself straining every nerve. The current of the Squatook varies greatly in speed, though nowhere is it otherwise than brisk. At first I gained rapidly on my pursuer, but presently we reached a spot where the banks were comparatively level and open, and here the panther caught up and kept abreast of me with ease. With a sudden sinking at the heart, I called to mind a narrow gorge a quarter of a mile ahead, from the sides of which several drooping trunks hung over the water. From one of these I thought the panther might easily reach me, running out and dropping into the canoe as I darted beneath. The idea was a blood-curdling one, and spurred me to more desperate effort. But before we neared the perilous pass, the banks grew so uneven and the underbrush so dense that my pursuer was much delayed, and consequently fell behind. The current quickening its speed at the same time, I was a good 10 yards in the lead as my canoe slid through the gorge and out into the white moonlight of one of the wider stretches of the stream. Here I slackened my pace in order to recover my wind, and the panther made up his lost ground. For the time I was out of his reach, and all he could do was to scream savagely. This, I supposed, was to summon his mate to the noble hunting he had provided for her, but to my inexpressible satisfaction no mate came. The beauty and the weirdness of the moonlit woods were now quite lost upon me. I saw only that long, fierce, light-bounding figure which so inexorably kept pace with me. To save my powers for some possible emergency, I resolved to content myself, for the time, with a very moderate degree of haste. The panther was in no way pressed to keep up with me. Suddenly he darted forward at his utmost speed. For a moment this did not trouble me, but then I awoke to its possible meaning. He was planning evidently an ambuscade, and I must keep an eye upon him. The order of the chase was promptly reversed, and I set out at once in a desperate pursuit. The obstructed shores and the increasing current favored me, so that he found it hard to shake me off. For the next half-mile I just managed to keep up with him. Then came another of those quieter reaches, and my pursuer at last got out of sight. Again I paused, not only to take breath, but to try and discover the brute's purpose in leaving me. All at once it flashed into my mind. Just before the river widens into Second Lake, there occurs a lively and somewhat broken rapid. As there was moonlight, and I knew the channels well, I had no dread of this rapid till suddenly I remembered 3 large boulders crossing the stream like stepping stones. It was plain to me that this was the point my adversary was anxious to reach ahead of me. These boulders were so placed that he could easily spring from one to the other dry shod, and his chance of intercepting me would be excellent. I almost lost courage. The best thing I could do under the circumstances was to save my strength to the utmost, so for a time I did little more than steer the canoe. When at last I rounded a turn and saw just ahead of me the white, thin-crested, singing ripples of the rapid, I was not at all surprised to see also the panther crouched on one of the rocks in mid-stream. At this point the river was somewhat spread out and the banks were low, so the moonlight showed me the channel quite clearly. You'll understand better when we run through in a day or two. I laid aside my paddle and took up the more trusty white spruce pole. With it I snubbed the canoe firmly, letting her drop down the slope inch by inch, while I took a cool and thorough survey of the ripples and cross-currents. From the sloping shoulder of the rock lying nearest to the left-hand bank, a strong cross-current took a slant sharply over toward the middle channel. I decided to stake my fate on the assistance of this cross-current. Gradually I snubbed the canoe over to the left bank, and then gave her her head. The shores slipped past. The rocks, with that crouching sentinel on the central one, seemed to glide upstream to meet me. I was almost in the passage when, with a superb bound, the panther shot through the moonlight and lit upon the rock I was approaching. As he poised himself, gaining his balance with some difficulty on the narrow foothold, a strong lunge with my pole twisted the canoe into the swirl of that cross-current, and with the next thrust I slid like lightning down the middle channel before my adversary had more than got himself fairly turned around. With a shout of exultation I raced down the rest of the incline and into widening reaches, safe from pursuit. The panther, screaming angrily, followed me for a time, but soon the receding shores placed such a distance between us that I ceased to regard him. Presently I bade him a final farewell, and headed across the lake for the spot where the campfire was waving me a ruddy welcome. "Well, that's getting pretty near home," remarked Ranolf, glancing apprehensively into the gloom behind the camp. "You don't suppose that chap would be waiting around here for you, Stranion? If so, I hope he won't mistake me for you." "Let Sam give us something cheerful now," demanded Magnus. "Well," said Sam, "I'll give you a story of the lumber camps. I'll call it Bruin and the Cook." As the O.M. is going to dress up our yarns for the cold light of print, I must be allowed to preface the story with a few introductory remarks on the life of the lumberman in winter. Stranion and the O.M. know all about that, but the rest of you fellows never go to the lumber camps, you know. To one who visits the winter camps here in our backwoods, the life led by the loggers is likely to seem monotonous after the strangeness of it has worn off. The sounds of the chopping, the shouting, the clanking of the teams afford ample warning to all the wild creatures of the woods, who thereupon generally agree in giving a wide berth to a neighborhood which has suddenly grown so populous and noisy. In chopping and hauling logs, the lumbermen are at work unremittingly from dawn until sundown, and at night they have little energy to expend on the hunting of bears or panthers. The bunks and the blankets exert an overwhelming attraction, and by the time the men have concluded their after-supper smoke, and the sound of a few rough songs has died away, the wild beasts may creep near enough to smell the pork and beans, and may prowl about the camp until dawn, with small fear of molestation from the sleepers within. At intervals, however, the monotony of camp life is broken. Something occurs to remind the careless woodsman that, though in the wilderness indeed, they are yet not truly of it. They are made suddenly aware of those shy but savage forces which, regarding them ever as trespassers, have been keeping them under an angry and eager surveillance. The spirit of the violated forest makes a swift and sometimes effectual, but always unexpected, stroke for vengeance. A yoke of oxen are straining at their load. A great branch reaching down catches the nearest ox by the horn, and the poor brute falls in its track with its neck broken. A stout sapling is bent to the ground by a weight of ice and snow. Some thaw, or the shock of a passing team, releases it, and by the fierce recoil a horse's leg is shattered. A lumberman has strayed off into the woods by himself, perchance to gather spruce gum for his friends in the settlements, and he is found, days afterwards, half eaten by bears and foxes. A solitary chopper throws down his axe and leans against a tree to rest and dream, and a panther drops from the branches above and tears him. Yet such vengeance is accomplished but seldom, and makes no permanent impression on the heedless woodsman. His onward march is inexorable. The cook, it must be borne in mind, is a most important personage in the lumber camp. This I say of camp cooks in general, and I assert it in particular of the cook who figures as one of the heroes of my story. The other hero is the bear. It was a bright March morning at Nicholson's camp over on Salmon River. There had been a heavy thaw for some days, and the snow banks under the eaves of the camp were shrinking rapidly. The bright chips about the door, the trampled straw and fodder around the stable, were steaming and soaking under the steady sun. Such winds as were stirring abroad that day were quite shut off from the camp by the dark surrounding woods. From the protruding stovepipe, which did duty as a chimney, a faint blue wreath of smoke curled lazily. The cook had the camp all to himself for a while, for the teams and choppers were at work a mile away, and the cookee, as the cook's assistant is called, had betaken himself to a neighboring pond to fish for trout through the ice. The dishes were washed, the camp was in order, and in a little while all would be time to get the dinner ready. The inevitable pork and beans were slowly boiling, and an appetizing fragrance was abroad on the quiet air. The cook decided to snatch a wink of sleep in his bunk beneath the eaves. He had a spare half-hour before him, and under his present circumstances he knew no better way of spending it. The weather being mild, he left the camp door wide open, and, swinging up to his berth, soon had himself luxuriously bedded in blankets, his own and as many of other fellows' blankets as he liked. He began to doze and dream. He dreamed of summer fields, and then of a lively Sunday school picnic, and at last of the music of a band which he heard crashing in his ears. Then the cymbals and the big drum grew unbearably loud, and, waking with a start, he remembered where he was, and thrust his head in astonishment over the edge of the bunk. The sight that met his eyes filled him with alarm and indignation. The prolonged thaw had brought out the bears from their snug winter quarters, and now, in a very bad humor from having been waked up too soon, they were prowling round the forest in unusual numbers. Food was scarce. In fact, times were very hard with them, and they were not only bad-tempered, but lean and hungry withal. To one particularly hungry bear the smell of our cook's simmering pork had come that morning like the invitation to a feast. The supposed invitation had been accepted with a rapturous alacrity. Bruin had found the door open, the coast clear, the quarters very inviting. With the utmost good faith he had entered upon his fortune. To find the source of that entrancing fragrance had been to his trained nose a simple matter. While cook slept sweetly, Bruin had rooted off the cover of the pot, and this was the beginning of cook's dream. But the pot was hot, and the first mouthful of the savory mess made him yell with rage and pain. At this point the trumpets and clarions grew shrill in cook's dreaming ears. Then an angry sweep of the great paw had dashed pot and kettle off the stove in a thunder of crashing iron and clattering tins. This was the point at which cook's dream had attained overwhelming reality. What met his round-eyed gaze as he sat up in his blankets was an angry bear dancing about in a confusion of steam and smoke and beans and kettles, making ineffectual snatches at a lump of scalding pork upon the floor. After a moment of suspense, cook rose softly and crept to the other end of the bunks, where a gun was kept. To his disgust, the weapon was unloaded, but the click of the lock had caught the bear's attention. Glancing up at the bunk above him, the brute's eyes detected the shrinking cook, and straightway he overflowed with wrath. Here, evidently, was the author of his discomfort. With smarting jaws and vengeful paws, he made a dash for the bunk. Its edge was nearly 7 feet from the floor, so Bruin had to do some clambering. As his head appeared over the edge, and his great paws took firm hold upon the clapboard rim of the bunk, cook, now grown desperate, struck at him wildly with the heavy butt of the gun. But Bruin is always a skillful boxer. With an upward stroke he warded off the blow, and sent the weapon spinning across the camp. At the same time, however, his weight proved too much for the frail clapboard to which he was holding, and back he fell on the floor with a shock like an earthquake. This repulse, which of course he credited to the cook, only filled him with tenfold greater fury, and at once he sprang back to the assault. But the delay, however brief, had given poor cook time to grasp an idea, which he proceeded to act upon with eagerness. He saw that the hole in the roof through which the stovepipe protruded was large enough to give his body passage. Snatching at a light rafter above his head, he swung himself out of the bunk and kicked the stovepipe from its place. The sections fell with loud clatter upon the stove and the bear, for a moment disconcerting Bruin's plans. From the rafter it was an easy reach to the opening in the roof, and as Bruin gained the empty bunk and stretched his paw eagerly up toward his intended victim on the rafter, the intended victim slipped with the greatest promptitude through the hole. At this point the cook drew a long breath and persuaded his heart to go down out of his throat, where it had been since he waked, and resume its proper functions. His first thought was to drop from the roof and run for help, but fortunately he changed his mind. The bear was no fool. No sooner had the cook got safely out upon the roof than Bruin rushed forth from the camp door, expecting to catch him as he came down. Had cook acted upon his first impulse, he would have been overtaken before he had gone 100 yards, and would have perished hideously in the snow. As it was, however, evidently to Bruin's deep chagrin, he stuck close to the chimney-hole, like a prairie dog sitting by his burrow, ready at a moment's notice to plunge within, while the bear stalked deliberately twice around the camp, eyeing him, and evidently laying plans, as it were, for his capture. At last the bear appeared to make up his mind. At one corner of the shanty, piled up nearly to the eaves, was a store of firewood, which a cookee had gathered in. Upon this pile Bruin mounted, and then made a dash up the creaking roof. Cook prayed most fervently that it might give way beneath the great weight of the bear, and to see if it would do so he waited almost too long. But it did not. As he scurried, belated, through the hole, the bear's paw reached its edge, and the huge claws tore nearly all the flesh from the back of the poor fellow's hand. Bleeding and trembling, he crouched upon the friendly rafter, not daring to swing down into the bunk. The agility of that great animal was marvelous. Scarcely had cook got under shelter when Bruin rushed in again at the door, and was up on the bunk again in a twinkling, and again cook vanished by the chimney-place. A moment later the bear was again on the roof, while cook once more crouched back faintly on his rafter. This performance was repeated several times, till for cook it had quite ceased to be interesting. At last the chase grew monotonous, even to the indefatigable Bruin, who then resolved upon a change of tactics. After driving cook out through the chimney, he decided to try the same mode of exit for himself, or at least to thrust his head through the opening and see what it was like. Embracing the woodwork with his powerful forepaws, he swung himself up on the rafter as he had seen Cook do so gracefully. The attempt was quite successful, but the rafter was not prepared for the strain, and Bruin and beam came thundering to the floor. As Cook gazed down through the hole and marked what had happened, his heart sank utterly within him. His one safe retreat was gone. But Bruin did not perceive his advantage, or else was in no hurry to follow it up. The shock had greatly dampened his zeal. He sat on his haunches by the stove and gazed up sullenly at Cook, while Cook gazed back despairingly at him. Then the bear noticed that the precious pork had got deliciously cool, and in the charms of that rare morsel Cook was soon quite forgotten. All Cook had to do was to lie on the roof, nursing his lacerated hand, and watch Bruin as he made away with the lumberman's dinner, a labor of love in which he lost no time. At this junction a noise was heard in the woods, and hope came back to the cook's heart. The men were returning for dinner. Bruin heard it too, and made haste to gulp down the remnant of the beans. Just as teams and choppers emerged into the little cleared space in front of the camp, Bruin, having swallowed his last mouthful, rushed out of the camp door, to the breathless and immeasurable amazement of the lumbermen. Finding himself to all appearances surrounded, Bruin paused a moment irresolutely. Then, charging upon the nearest team, he dealt the teamster a terrific cuff, bowling him over in the snow and breaking his arm, while the maddened horses plunged, reared, and fell over backward in a tangle of sleds and traces and lashing heels. This episode brought the woodsmen to their senses. Axe in hand, they closed in upon the bear, who rose on his hindquarters to meet them. The first few blows that were delivered at him with all the force of practised arms and vindictive energy he warded off as if they were so many feathers, but he could not guard himself on all sides at once. A well-directed blow from the rear sank the axe-head deep between his foreshoulders, severing the spinal column, and Bruin collapsed, a furry heap, upon the crimsoned snow. In their indignation over the cook's torn hand, their comrade's broken arm, and, perhaps most aggravating of all, their thoroughly demolished dinner, the lumbermen undertook to make a meal of Bruin. But in this attempt Bruin found a measure of revenge, for in death he proved to be even tougher than he had been in life, and the famous luxury of a fat bear steak was nowhere to be had from his carcass. "And now, Magnus," continued Sam, cleaning out his pipe, "we'll have something remote and tropical from you, with your kind permission. What else has happened to that uncle of yours?" "Lots of things," said the imperturbable Magnus. "I'll tell you one of his Mexican stories, which he calls An Encounter with Peccaries." End of Chapter 3, Part 1.